A jail cell was the first sound Ken Curtis ever fell asleep to. Not lullabies, not crickets through an open window, but iron bars clanging shut and men with nowhere left to go murmuring in the dark below. Born Curtis Wayne Gates on July 2, 1916 in Lamar, Colorado, he came into a world that offered very little softness and expected none in return. His father, Dan Gates, served as sheriff of Bent County, and that job came with an unusual family arrangement, a small apartment built directly above the county jail, which meant young Ken grew up listening to confinement the way other boys listened to the radio. His mother, Nellie, cooked 3 meals a day for both the family and the prisoners, and Ken stood beside her every time she slid food trays through iron bars, watching hardened men receive that small act of care with their eyes cast down. That daily ritual taught him something no school could have, that dignity belongs to people regardless of what they've done, and that kindness offered without expectation carries more weight than any formal authority ever could. Lamar in the 1930s sat pressed against the Great Plains with the Depression squeezing every family that lived there, and entertainment ranked somewhere far below survival on the list of things people allowed themselves to want. Music found Ken regardless. He sang at school, in church, at county gatherings, and the voice that came out of him, warm, deep, and textured with something that sounded like genuine experience, made people stop what they were doing. His parents, shaped by practical necessity the way most people of that era were, pointed him toward medicine, and for 2 years he enrolled at Colorado College and genuinely tried to convince himself it was the right path. The convincing never quite took. He would slip away from his dormitory to perform at campus events and feel the audience respond in a way that nothing in a lecture hall ever had. Not as vanity, but as recognition, the specific sensation of being exactly where you were supposed to be. Leaving medicine behind looked reckless from the outside and felt completely logical from the inside, and by the early 1940s, it had started paying off. Tommy Dorsey's orchestra was among the most celebrated swing bands in America, and Ken stepped into the vacancy left behind by Frank Sinatra, a gap that would have swallowed most singers whole. He handled it with steadiness and earned confidence, touring the country and building an audience that responded to his voice the way people respond to something genuine. Dorsey mentored him seriously, teaching him what professionalism looks like when pressure is highest, and gave him a gift that would follow him the rest of his career, a new name. Curtis Wayne Gates became Ken Curtis, shorter, stronger, and built to last on a marquee. From Dorsey's band, Ken moved into the Sons of the Pioneers, the Western music group whose harmonies had defined an entire American sound, and through recordings like Room Full of Roses and Ghost Riders in the Sky, his voice reached living rooms from California to Virginia. These weren't songs people simply listened to and forgot. They were company for long evenings and quiet afternoons, and through them, Ken was earning something more durable than popularity. He was earning trust. Radio extended that relationship through Chuck Wagon Jamboree, a syndicated 15-minute show out of Los Angeles that ran for more than 130 episodes and mixed cowboy songs with plain moral storytelling, exactly the kind of content that worked because it was honest rather than constructed. Hollywood came for him around the mid-1940s, when Westerns had seized the American imagination, and producers needed men who looked like they'd actually lived the life rather than studied it. Small roles arrived first, and that's when John Ford noticed him. Ford ranks among the most commanding directors the American film industry has ever produced, a man who built careers with enormous force, applied at precisely the right moments, and no patience for hesitation. He had shaped John Wayne and Henry Fonda and an entire generation of actors who carried his influence long after their collaborations ended. What Ford saw in Ken was something that couldn't be rehearsed, real cowboy roots and a face that didn't perform emotions, it simply had them. Ken joined Ford's circle and appeared in Rio Grande, The Quiet Man, and The Searchers, working under a director who could humiliate an actor in front of a full cast and expect professional gratitude by the following morning. Ken absorbed that pressure without visible strain, staying calm and never giving Ford a reason to question him. That capacity for stillness under difficult conditions became a permanent feature of how he moved through his professional life. Ford also set the stage, without intending to, for one of Ken's most complicated personal chapters. In 1952, Ken married Barbara Ford, the director's daughter, and what looked like perfect Hollywood symmetry on paper translated in practice to a decade of feeling like a visitor in his own marriage. They separated in 1964 without public drama, just the honest exhaustion of two people who had run out of ways to pretend otherwise. Before Barbara, there had been actress Lorraine Page, whom Ken married in 1943 when both were young and pointed at identical dreams in a world already disrupted by war. Wartime tours and competing ambitions wore that early love down until there wasn't enough left to justify continuing, and they parted without cruelty. None of this broke Ken. What it did was make him careful and clear-eyed, and he became known in Hollywood as dependable, prepared, and never the origin point of a problem. But that clarity had a cost, because he could now see exactly how rarely loyalty survived in this industry. Then came 1964, and the offer that would define the next 11 years of his life more completely than anything before it. Gunsmoke was already one of television's most established dramas when Ken was brought in to replace Dennis Weaver, who had played Deputy Chester Good and moved on. The character created for Ken was Festus Hagen, scruffy, sharp-tongued, deeply loyal, with a crooked smile, and the ability to deliver plain wisdom in a way that landed harder than anything polished could. Audiences didn't merely accept Festus, they claimed him immediately, with the intensity that viewers reserve for characters who feel like someone they actually know. Within months, what had been a single-episode tryout became a permanent role, and over 11 seasons, Ken appeared in more than 300 episodes, making Festus Hagen one of the most loved figures in the history of American television. Success on that scale arrived with its own complications, and the 5 names Ken carried into his final years tell that story better than any production history could. James Arness commanded Gunsmoke as Marshal Matt Dillon, with authority that extended well beyond the camera frame. Physically commanding and keenly aware of the hierarchy that existed on that set, Ken respected his craft without reservation. The permanent distance between them was harder to reconcile. That consistent understanding that no matter how audiences responded to Festus, his position remained fixed. He was always the deputy. Both men maintained professionalism across all 11 years. Warmth was never part of the arrangement. Milburn Stone, who played Doc Adams, carried his own difficulties into the working relationship. Stone was experienced, deeply opinionated, and not naturally inclined to share creative territory without resistance, and disagreements over script interpretation and screen time accumulated across years, the way small resentments always do when proud people share a limited stage for a very long time. None of it became a public confrontation. And here's the thing. When Stone became seriously ill in 1971, Ken visited him privately, without announcement, holding a long-standing grievance with one hand while showing up when it mattered with the other. John Mantley, the show's producer, represented the most openly contentious relationship of Ken's Gunsmoke years. Mantley ran the production with strict discipline and a fixed vision, one in which Festus was a supporting character and would stay one regardless of what viewers thought. Ken fought for fairer compensation and pushed repeatedly for storylines that gave Festus real moral weight, and Mantley refused each time, treating Ken's position as a settled fact rather than an ongoing negotiation. The feud grew progressively open until, by the final season, the two men could barely manage obligatory courtesy when circumstances forced them together. Amanda Blake, who played Miss Kitty, had been genuinely warm with Ken through the earlier seasons. As Festus grew more popular, that ease quietly thinned, and whether the source was professional anxiety or simply the strain of a long-running production, the goodwill between them didn't survive the full 11 years. Dennis Weaver, by contrast, was the one name on Ken's list that represents something almost philosophical, because the two men never shared a set once, Weaver having already left before Festus arrived. But the comparison followed Ken for 11 consecutive years anyway, fans debating the original deputy against the new one. He had built Festus entirely from his own instincts and history, and still the shadow of a man he had never worked with measured his performance against a standard he had no hand in creating. Gunsmoke ended in 1975, and Ken, now 59 years old, handled the closing without public grievance or drama, with a steady recognition that good things run their natural course. When CBS announced the 1987 reunion film Gunsmoke returned to Dodge, Arness returned, Blake returned, and fans fully expected Festus alongside them. Ken declined. The network's offer fell so far below what 11 years of work had earned that accepting it would have meant agreeing with their assessment of what those years were worth. Some fans were confused. Those who knew him understood this wasn't old bitterness. It was a man choosing, at the last possible moment, not to participate in his own diminishment. His personal life had found a peace by then that the earlier years had withheld. Ken met Tori Connolly in 1966, a woman with no connection to Hollywood and no interest in its machinery, and they married quietly and stayed married for the rest of his life. She gave him something simpler and more durable than any professional achievement: fishing trips, family mornings, days that belonged entirely to him. He became a devoted stepfather to her 2 children, offering the steady reliability his own father had once provided above that Bent County jail. His conservative political beliefs drew occasional attention. He supported Barry Goldwater in 1964 and Ronald Reagan in 1976, but Ken treated his convictions as his own and nobody else's concern. On April 28, 1991, Ken Curtis died peacefully in his sleep from a heart attack at his home in Clovis, California, at the age of 74, and his ashes were scattered across the Colorado plains not far from where a boy had once fallen asleep to iron doors closing in the dark below him. What remains is not the list of names that once caused him pain. Those were real, but they were human. The ordinary cost of caring deeply inside an industry that rarely returned the favor. What remains is Festus Hagen, moving through Dodge City with that crooked walk and unhurried, honest wisdom that no writer fully wrote and no director fully directed, because Ken brought that entirely from himself. From a jailhouse kitchen in Colorado, a swing band stage in New York, and a John Ford film set where silence meant you were doing your job right. And what remains is the lesson he carried out of Bent County and never once put down, that dignity isn't something people earn, it's something they already have. Ken Curtis never stopped believing that, not in Hollywood, not across 11 long seasons, and not in the quiet final years of a life lived completely on his own terms,